By late 1944, the military situation for Nazi Germany was beyond critical. It was terminal. Following the catastrophic destruction of the German armies in Normandy, the rapid collapse of the front, and the relentless advance of the Soviet forces from the east, the German High Command faced the grim, existential reality of a final, grinding defeat onto massive, insurmountable fronts. The Western Allies had successfully crossed the French border, and their powerful armies were closing in on the crucial defenses of the German frontier. The war was clearly and irrevocably lost, yet Adolf Hitler, driven by delusional hubris, profound denial of reality, and an unshakable belief in the power of a single, massive counterstrike, resolved to launch one final, immense offensive designed not merely to delay defeat, but to shatter the Western Allied coalition and fundamentally reverse the course of the war. This desperate, colossal undertaking was codenamed Operation Watch on the Rhine, a direct translation of the German term. The objective was strategically audacious, strategically absurd, and depended entirely on achieving absolute tactical surprise. Hitler's core plan was to assemble his last remaining armored reserves, launch a surprise attack through the heavily forested, mountainous Ardennes region of Belgium and Luxembourg, and drive relentlessly westward. The ultimate, non-negotiable target of this thrust was the massive, indispensable port city of Antwerp in Belgium. Antwerp was the crucial, central logistical hub for the entire Allied Western Front. If the German forces could capture Antwerp, they would effectively cut off the entire northern British and American armies from their vital supply lines. This maneuver, Hitler believed, would force the Allied armies into a massive, immediate retreat, inflict a devastating political and military humiliation, and potentially fracture the Anglo-American alliance, forcing the Western Allies to sue for a separate, favorable peace, thus allowing Germany to concentrate its remaining strength entirely on the critical Eastern Front. The choice of the Ardennes as the launch point for this final offensive was not accidental. It was a calculated risk based on past success and present vulnerability. This region was the very same sector through which German tanks had successfully executed the decisive breakthrough during the Battle of France in 1940. Critically, the German intelligence reports confirmed that the front line in the Ardennes was currently held by the most inexperienced and most combat-fatigued American divisions, who had been moved there precisely because Allied High Command considered the terrain too difficult and the area too quiet for any major German attack. This intelligence provided the necessary tactical vulnerability that Hitler desperately needed for his plan to succeed. However, the German planning suffered from immense, debilitating flaws that doomed the operation before it began. Resources were catastrophically scarce. The offensive required the full commitment of the final German armored reserves, the best remaining tanks, crews, and infantry, a commitment that, if it failed, would leave the entire Western Front utterly defenseless. Furthermore, the immense logistical requirements, particularly the massive quantities of fuel needed to drive the armored divisions over 100 miles to Antwerp, were far beyond Germany's remaining domestic capacity. The entire offensive was therefore predicated on seizing Allied fuel dumps along the route, a military necessity that required absolute success and lightning speed, making the operation a monumental, almost insane gamble. The political stakes were terminal. For Hitler, it was a chance at immortality. For Germany, it was the final, devastating expenditure of resources that would guarantee the swift conclusion of the war in the West. The success of the entire, immense offensive was absolutely dependent on achieving absolute and total surprise. By late 1944, the Allied air forces enjoyed near total control of the skies over Western Europe, making large-scale German troop and armor movements during daylight hours virtually impossible. Any significant gathering of reserves, especially massive concentrations of tanks and heavy artillery, would have been immediately spotted by Allied reconnaissance planes and instantly targeted by overwhelming aerial bombing. The German High Command, therefore, undertook an enormous and deeply complex logistical effort to mask the final gathering of their remaining strength, requiring unprecedented secrecy and operational discipline across the entire front. The concentration of forces involving the transfer of armored divisions and specialized infantry from the Eastern Front and from reserves protecting Germany itself was executed almost exclusively at night and under meticulous camouflage. Tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces were moved along secondary roads, always seeking the cover of the heavy forests of the Ardennes, and were carefully hidden during the day under netting, foliage, and in barns and villages. All radio traffic related to the massive buildup was strictly forbidden or deliberately kept to minimum, non-critical levels to prevent Allied intelligence from detecting the unusual activity. The sheer scale of this secretive maneuver, moving hundreds of thousands of men and thousands of vehicles into a small sector without detection, was a monumental logistical achievement that stands as a testament to the German army's organizational skill even in the final, desperate stages of the war. Crucially, the German plan included a sinister and highly specialized component designed to sow utter chaos and confusion behind the American lines, a special operation led by German commando leader Otto Skorzeny. This operation involved assembling a unit of German soldiers who were fluent in English, outfitting them in captured American uniforms, and providing them with captured American jeeps and military vehicles. Their mission was to infiltrate the American rear areas immediately following the initial breakthrough. These commandos were tasked with multiple objectives: cutting communication lines, reversing road signs to misdirect American reserve units, spreading false rumors to incite panic among the rear echelon troops, and, most critically, identifying and securing key strategic bridges and, particularly, Allied fuel dumps. The entire German offensive was predicated on seizing this fuel, so the commandos were essential reconnaissance scouts for the advancing tanks. The execution of this commando operation, while successful in creating immediate fear and suspicion among American troops leading to security checks and paranoia across the entire Allied rear area, ultimately failed to achieve its overall strategic goal of mass disruption. However, the immense success of the overall deception effort was undeniable. Despite receiving some minor intelligence warnings from their own troops on the quiet front, the Allied High Command, obsessed with the notion that the main German reserves were still concentrated near the Rhine River and focused on the massive logistical buildup for their own upcoming offensives, completely failed to detect the massive, immediate threat being staged directly under their noses: the heavy cloud cover and fog, which prevented Allied aerial reconnaissance flights for weeks, provided the final, essential element of natural camouflage. The entire German armored force was assembled, concealed, and ready to launch its last great surprise. The immense, meticulously planned apparatus of the German offensive, known as Operation Watch on the Rhine, was unleashed on the quiet, snowy front of the Ardennes in the pre-dawn hours of December 16, 1944. The execution of the attack was predicated entirely on the element of surprise and the crippling power of the initial concentrated blow. For weeks, the Allied command had viewed the Ardennes as the ghost front, a quiet, remote sector unsuitable for large-scale offensive operations, defended by the least experienced and most combat-fatigued American divisions. This pervasive, fatal complacency within the Allied High Command proved to be the single greatest asset for the German plan. The attack began at 5:30 a.m. with a massive, coordinated German artillery barrage that spanned 80 miles of the front line. Thousands of German guns, mortar, and rocket launchers, secretly brought into forward positions under the cover of darkness, opened fire simultaneously. This sudden, immense concentration of high explosive shells was designed not only to destroy American forward observation posts, communication lines, and command centers, but also to inflict a profound psychological shock on the defending American troops. For the inexperienced, untested units holding this quiet sector, the overwhelming, unexpected intensity of the barrage was a terrifying, paralyzing experience, the absolute confirmation that the war they thought was quiet had just exploded into an existential crisis. The entire front was instantly transformed from a calm, static line into a chaotic, violent inferno, achieving the critical element of surprise necessary for the armored breakthrough that was to follow. Crucially, the attack was launched under the cover of dense, persistent fog and low-hanging clouds, a meteorological condition that had plagued the European theater for weeks. This natural camouflage was absolutely vital to the German plan, providing the second, critical layer of defense. The poor visibility effectively neutralized the single greatest advantage possessed by the Allies: absolute air superiority. The German commanders knew that if the powerful Allied air forces, the British Royal Air Force, and the American 9th and 8th Air Forces were able to fly, they would immediately spot the massive German tank concentrations and shatter the entire offensive before it could cross the Meuse River. The fog and low clouds provided the necessary shield, grounding the Allied fighter bombers and ensuring that the German armored divisions could move forward unchecked during the critical opening days of the offensive. As the artillery fire lifted, the German armored divisions, spearheaded by elite SS armored corps and powerful assault guns, began their push forward. The German plan called for massive columns to follow the narrow, pre-selected road networks through the forests. The immediate objective was to bypass any stiff resistance and drive deep into the American rear. The defense offered by the forward American units was, initially, fragmented and disorganized, entirely overwhelmed by the weight of the attack and the sheer shock of the surprise. Communication lines were immediately cut, command units were overrun, and vast columns of German tanks poured through the immense gaps created in the American line. For hours, the American high command remained in a state of confused denial, unsure if the attack was merely a localized spoiling attack or the massive, final offensive that Hitler had been rumored to be planning. This initial paralysis provided the German armored spearheads with the necessary hours to gain the crucial ground that would define the bulge in the front line. The final, desperate gamble had been cast, and its initial success threatened to rip the entire Allied Western Front wide open. As the main German armored thrust tore through the center of the weak American lines, the fate of the entire offensive hinged on the response along the northern and southern flanks of the massive bulge. The northern shoulder of the offensive was led by the most powerful and ruthless German armored formations, the 6th Panzer Army, which included several elite SS armored divisions. This force was tasked with the most ambitious goal: breaking through the northernmost American defenses, seizing the vast road network of Liege, and ultimately capturing the crucial Allied supply port of Antwerp. The failure or success of this northern pincer was critical, as it represented the shortest and most direct route to the sea. The German 6th Panzer Army immediately collided with the unexpected, tenacious, and fierce resistance offered by resilient American units, primarily the veteran the 5th Corps and other divisions stationed near the Elsenborn Ridge. This area, characterized by rugged hills and dense forests, became the site of one of the earliest and most decisive turning points of the Battle of the Bulge. The German commanders had anticipated that this sector would crumble quickly, allowing their elite armored columns to maintain their lightning speed. Instead, the American defenders, despite being severely outnumbered, managed to utilize the terrain's natural defensive advantages to their fullest extent. The high ground of the Elsenborn Ridge provided the American artillery with crucial observation points, allowing them to rain devastating, accurate fire down onto the narrow, predetermined German advance routes. The American defense here was an unyielding wall of concentrated artillery and infantry fire, successfully slowing the elite German divisions to a frustrating, costly crawl. The American forces resolutely held the northern shoulder, preventing the German 6th Panzer Army from ever achieving the critical breakthrough necessary to swing north and attack Liege and Antwerp. This unexpected stand at Elsenborn fatally disrupted the entire German strategic timetable, effectively paralyzing the most powerful pincer of the attack. Compounding the intensity of the fighting in the north were the immediate, shocking atrocities committed by the German troops. A key mobile formation of the 6th Panzer Army, a combat group led by Colonel Joachim Peiper, managed to achieve a deep initial penetration, utilizing speed to bypass resistance. However, their advance was marred by unspeakable acts of cruelty. Near the Belgian village of Malmedy, On December 17, 1944, Piper's troops captured approximately 84 unarmed American prisoners of war and summarily executed them in a nearby field. This brutal act of mass murder, and others committed by Piper's group against both civilians and prisoners, immediately hardened the resolve of the remaining American troops, extinguishing any notion of surrender and fueling a fierce, tenacious defense across the entire front. The immediate news of the Malmedy massacre galvanized the entire American army, making it clear that they were fighting not just for territory, but for their very lives against a ruthless and desperate enemy. The combined effect of the successful defensive stand at the Elsenborn Ridge and the moral outrage caused by the German atrocities ensured that the critical northern front held firm. The failure of the 6th Panzer Army to achieve its primary objective of breaking out into the open Belgian plain forced the German High Command to divert the limited remaining fuel and resources, critically necessary for the central thrust, to reinforce the struggling northern sector. The vital time lost in this futile, bloody engagement was irreversible, guaranteeing that the German offensive could not achieve the swift, decisive victory that Hitler's desperate gamble required. While the German 6th Panzer Army was decisively stalled and severely depleted by the determined American defense on the northern shoulder, the true strategic threat of the offensive emerged in the central and southern sectors, where General Hasso von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army and its supporting units managed to achieve devastating, deep penetrations. The German High Command's primary operational goal, the seizure of the crucial logistical hub at Antwerp, depended entirely on the speed and success of this central thrust, which was now desperately racing for the final, critical geographical obstacle, the Meuse River. Crossing the Meuse would put the German armored columns on the open roads to Brussels and Antwerp, making the seizure of the port a realistic possibility. The central assault benefited immediately from the fatal underestimation of the Ardennes by the Allied High Command. The German forces struck the American lines where the defending units were often inexperienced, scattered, and lacking the necessary heavy anti-tank weaponry to repel a coordinated armored attack. Utilizing the cover of the persistent fog and low clouds that grounded the devastating Allied air forces, the German armored divisions, including the powerful Panzer Corps, achieved rapid, frightening breakthroughs. The German strategy was to bypass any serious centers of resistance, ignore their exposed flanks, and race ahead, adhering strictly to the blitzkrieg principle of speed and deep penetration. The front line quickly bulged outward, creating the massive, defining bulge that gave the battle its name. The German advance quickly generated an immense logistical crisis that threatened to doom the entire operation. As the tank columns plunged deeper into American territory, their original, carefully hoarded fuel reserves rapidly diminished. The entire German plan was predicated on this central thrust, reaching and immediately seizing the massive American fuel depots located near the Meuse River. The distance between the German start line and the Meuse was roughly 60 miles, 97 kilometers, a distance that represented the absolute limit of the German tank's operational range without immediate resupply. The speed of the advance became a desperate, two-sided gamble. The German command needed speed to seize the fuel before their tanks ran dry, while the American defenders needed speed to destroy the vital depots before the German tanks arrived. This dependency on captured enemy resources made the central thrust the most volatile and critical element of the entire offensive. In the face of the overwhelming German armored flood, the American defense was initially disorganized, leading to mass confusion and tactical chaos. Isolated American units, cut off and surrounded, fought fiercely in local, heroic actions that proved vital in delaying the German advance and causing the armored columns to fragment. However, the German spearheads continued their relentless westward drive. Elements of the German armored forces reached their farthest point of penetration near the town of Sels, just 4 miles, 6 kilometers short of the Meuse River. This represented the absolute high water mark of the entire German offensive in the west. They were within striking distance of the crucial crossings, their ultimate goal of cutting the Allied supply lines almost within their grasp. However, the final sprint was too long and too slow. The initial American defense, though brittle, had bought just enough time. Crucially, the Allied command, under the direct authority of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, recognized the supreme importance of the Meuse River as the final, unbreachable strategic barrier. Every available engineer, transport unit, and reserve formation was hastily rushed to the river crossings to establish a formidable, final defensive line. The German forces, exhausted, severely low on fuel, and facing the combined strength of the rapidly assembling American defenses, were forced to halt, unable to launch the final, desperate push required to cross the river and seize the fuel necessary for the final drive to Antwerp. The fate of the offensive now rested on the outcome of the immediate struggle over the crucial road junctions behind the main fighting line. As the German armored spearheads, driving relentlessly through the center of the American lines, began their desperate race toward the Meuse River, they collided with a small, seemingly insignificant Belgian town that held immense, disproportionate strategic importance, Bastogne. This otherwise unremarkable town served as the critical nexus of the entire southern Ardennes road network. All 7 major roads in the region converged on Bastogne, making it an absolutely vital junction for both the German offensive and the subsequent Allied counterattack. If the Germans failed to control Bastogne, their massive armored columns would be forced onto secondary roads, severely disrupting their supply lines and stalling their vital momentum. The Allied command instantly recognized this strategic choke point, and the defense of Bastogne became the central, most defining episode of the entire battle. In a brilliant display of strategic foresight and rapid deployment, General Dwight D. Eisenhower diverted 2 of the U.S. Army's most elite, battle-hardened units, the 101st Airborne Division Screaming Eagles, and elements of the 82nd Airborne Division from their reserve positions, and rushed them into the Ardennes. The 101st, moving with desperate speed in trucks through the snow and chaos, arrived at Bastogne just hours before the German armored columns surrounded the town on December 20, 1944. The American airborne troops immediately established a comprehensive, circular defensive perimeter, preparing to withstand a siege of unknown duration. Their mission was clear and non-negotiable: hold the town and its road network at all costs, preventing the German armored forces from advancing along the critical, best paved routes. The subsequent siege of Bastogne was characterized by brutal, sustained combat in freezing, miserable weather conditions. The German forces, desperate to clear the bottleneck, launched continuous, heavy attacks against the paratroopers' perimeter, utilizing tanks and superior numbers. However, the 101st, commanded in the field by Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, fought with fierce, tenacious skill, despite being completely cut off from Allied supply lines, running dangerously low on food, ammunition, and critical medical supplies, and constantly harassed by German artillery fire. The paratroopers refused to break. The most critical shortage was artillery ammunition, and the medical unit suffered horribly under the constant pressure. The sheer endurance and discipline of the airborne troops proved critical in neutralizing the German advantage in armor and numbers. The siege reached its legendary climax on December 22, 1944, when the German command delivered a formal ultimatum to the surrounded Americans, demanding their immediate surrender to avoid the complete annihilation of the American forces within Bastogne. General McAuliffe's now iconic, single-word written reply, "Nuts," became the defining moral and psychological turning point of the Battle of the Bulge. This defiant refusal, simple yet powerful, galvanized the morale of the entire American army, transforming the defensive stand into an act of profound, unbreakable resistance against a ruthless enemy. Strategically, the siege was an unmitigated disaster for the German offensive. The continuous, 4-day stand by the 101st Airborne fatally stalled the German momentum. The German armored forces were forced to waste immense time, fuel, and irreplaceable resources in futile attempts to reduce the stubborn defense, while their main supply routes remained dangerously exposed to the gathering Allied reserves. By forcing the Germans to commit valuable armored divisions to a time-consuming siege, the defense of Bastogne bought the crucial days necessary for the vast power of the Allied counterattack to be mobilized. ultimately ensuring that the German armored spearheads trapped near the Meuse River would not be reinforced or resupplied. The town held, and the German offensive was doomed to bleed itself dry against this single, immovable point of American defiance. By the final week of December 1944, the ambitious German offensive had reached its operational and logistical breaking point. The relentless defense mounted by the American forces, most critically, the unyielding stand at Bastogne and the successful holding of the Elsenborn Ridge, had fatally consumed the German army's most valuable, non-renewable resource, time and fuel. The core of the German failure lay in the utter reliance on capturing enemy supply dumps, a necessity that became catastrophic when the lightning advance failed to materialize. The vast columns of German tanks and motorized infantry, having expended their initial fuel reserves, were now stalling across the cold, snow-covered roads of the Ardennes, unable to launch the final, desperate lunge toward the ultimate objective, the crossings of the Meuse River and the capture of Antwerp. The fuel crisis was immediate, pervasive, and ultimately decisive. German forces had to abandon hundreds of tanks, half-tracks, and supply vehicles along the roads simply because they ran out of gasoline. The fuel shortage was exacerbated by the fact that the commandos sent ahead to secure the Allied fuel depots were largely unsuccessful or captured, and the few depots they did seize were quickly rendered unusable or recovered by American counter units. The logistical system, already working under immense strain due to continuous Allied bombing of the German homeland and reliance on a chaotic, snow-choked network of secondary roads, could not deliver the millions of gallons of gasoline necessary to sustain the enormous armored divisions. The paralysis of the armored spearheads, which were now within 4 miles of the Meuse River, signaled the irreversible strategic failure of the entire offensive. The momentum was lost, and the German advance was officially over. This strategic halt provided the Allies with the final, crucial window needed to consolidate their position. The Meuse River became the definitive, final strategic barrier. General Dwight D. Eisenhower and the Allied High Command recognized that the entire fate of the Western Front now depended on preventing the German forces from crossing this final river line. Every available engineer, transport unit, and reserve formation was hastily rushed to the river crossings between Givet and Liege to establish an overwhelming, non-negotiable defensive perimeter. The American forces were swiftly reinforced by massive deployment of the British forces, commanded by Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, who was temporarily given command of the entire northern shoulder of the Bulge. The combined Allied forces created an impregnable wall, preparing for a siege and counterattack rather than a retreat. Crucially, the success of this defensive pivot was entirely dependent on the incredibly rapid, aggressive response orchestrated by General George S. Patton. Upon recognizing the sheer size of the German threat, Patton executed one of the most astonishing logistical feats of the war. He immediately halted his Third Army, which was actively engaged in fighting hundreds of miles to the south, and rapidly pivoted his entire army 90 degrees north. Within days, Patton's armored divisions began their relentless drive through the snow and chaotic roads towards the besieged town of Bastogne. This rapid strategic countermaneuver was the first major step in transitioning the Allied posture from emergency defense into a decisive counteroffensive. The German armored columns were now not only running out of fuel and stopped by the Meuse, but they were also facing the imminent threat of being encircled themselves by Patton's aggressive, rapidly arriving forces pushing from the south. The tide had officially turned. The initial overwhelming surprise was gone, and the German offensive was now surrounded, starved, and poised to be violently crushed. For the first critical week of the Battle of the Bulge, the German offensive had been blessed with the single most crucial tactical advantage: unrelenting, abysmal weather. The dense, low-hanging clouds, thick fog, and continuous snowfall had effectively grounded the immensely powerful Allied air forces, allowing German armored columns and supply convoys to move with relative impunity through the forests and along the roads of the Ardennes. This weather shield was indispensable to Hitler's desperate gamble, as it neutralized the Allies' overwhelming air superiority, which would have otherwise shattered the German attack before it could gain any significant ground. However, This critical tactical advantage, upon which the entire German plan depended, was about to vanish dramatically, signaling the irreversible turning point of the entire battle. On December 23, 1944, a profound and sudden change in weather conditions transformed the strategic landscape of the battle. The skies over the Ardennes suddenly began to clear, with the dense fog dissipating and the clouds lifting to reveal crisp, cold, and clear winter skies. This meteorological shift was nothing short of a divine intervention for the beleaguered Allied forces. The moment the visibility improved, the vast, previously grounded power of the British Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Forces, USAAF, was immediately unleashed. Thousands of fighter bombers, medium bombers, and reconnaissance aircraft swarmed into the skies above the Ardennes, eager to avenge the days of enforced idleness and eager to exact a devastating toll on the now exposed German forces. The impact of this sudden return of Allied air power was instantaneous, overwhelming, and utterly catastrophic for the German offensive. The German armored columns, which had been forced to halt to fuel shortages and stubborn American resistance, were now completely exposed on the narrow, snow-choked roads. German tanks, trucks, and supply convoys, previously hidden by the fog, became easy targets for the relentless waves of Allied fighter bombers. The pilots, flying at low altitudes, systematically attacked anything that moved, utilizing their powerful machine guns, rockets, and bombs to destroy German armor, disrupt supply lines, and spread utter panic among the retreating infantry. The roads that were once conduits for the German advance were now transformed into vast, burning junkyards of destroyed German equipment, littered with abandoned vehicles and the bodies of soldiers. The destruction wrought by Allied air power was multifaceted and debilitating. Not only did it directly destroy hundreds of German tanks and vehicles, but it also completely severed the already strained German logistical network. Supply convoys, desperately trying to bring fuel and ammunition to the stalled armored spearheads, were systematically obliterated. Any attempt to move reinforcements or reposition units was met with immediate, overwhelming aerial attack, effectively paralyzing the German command's ability to react or consolidate. The air attacks also had a profound psychological effect on the German troops, who had grown accustomed to moving without fear of aerial assault. The sudden, constant threat from above shattered morale, inducing widespread fear and disorganization. The clearing of the skies proved to be the single most decisive factor in sealing the fate of the German offensive. The once formidable German armored threat, stalled by a lack of fuel and fierce ground resistance, was now being systematically dismantled from above. The strategic initiative, which had been temporarily seized by the Germans through surprise, definitively swung back to the Allies. The German army, now trapped in a massive, exposed salient, facing overwhelming air and ground superiority, had no choice but to begin a slow, painful, and costly retreat under the relentless assault of the re-energized Allied forces. The desperate gamble had failed, and the final bill was being paid from the sky. With the German armored spearheads fatally stalled by the lack of fuel, the unwavering American defense at Bastogne, and the sudden, devastating return of Allied air power after December 23, 1944, the strategic initiative decisively swung back to the Allied forces. The German leadership, already aware that the primary goal of capturing Antwerp was irrevocably lost, faced the grim reality of extricating their exhausted forces from the deep, vulnerable bulge they had created. The Allied command seized this opportunity immediately, launching a massive, coordinated counteroffensive designed to eliminate the bulge, destroy the remaining German reserves, and restore the front lines. The central component of this counterattack was the relentless, aggressive drive launched by General George S. Patton's Third Army from the south. Patton, having executed the brilliant 90-degree pivot of his entire army earlier in the month, spearheaded the attack to relieve the besieged troops in Bastogne. The fighting was fierce and bloody, often conducted in intense house-to-house combat in the small, snow-choked towns. Patton's forces pushed relentlessly northwards, forcing the German units defending the southern face of the bulge into a costly, chaotic retreat. The speed and aggression of the American counterattack overwhelmed the already weakened German infantry and exposed the limitations of their compromised supply lines. Simultaneously, the 1st U.S. Army and forces under the temporary command of Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, who was commanding the northern shoulder of the Bulge, launched powerful counterattacks from the north and west. The Allied objective was a double envelopment to drive both the northern and southern flanks of the Bulge inward, meeting near the Belgian town of Houffalize. This maneuver was designed to repeat the catastrophic encirclement tactic that the Germans themselves had used with such devastating effect throughout the earlier phases of the war. The goal was to trap and destroy the German 5th and 6th Panzer armies before they could fully retreat. The German response to this coordinated counteroffensive was chaotic and desperate. The German commanders fought fiercely, utilizing the final remnants of their tanks and heavy artillery reserves to hold open narrow escape corridors. Recognizing the dire threat of total annihilation, the German High Command was forced to order a full, costly withdrawal back toward the German border. The retreat was a scene of immense confusion and loss. The German forces, harassed relentlessly by Allied fighter bombers, which now enjoyed continuous air supremacy and pressured by the converging ground forces, were forced to abandon hundreds of irreplaceable tanks, thousands of transport vehicles, and vast amounts of heavy equipment on the frozen roads. These abandoned vehicles, often destroyed by their own crews to prevent capture, littered the Ardennes, transforming the beautiful, snowy landscape into a massive junkyard of shattered German ambition. The Allied pincers eventually met near Houffalize in mid-January 1945, though the majority of the German infantry and the core of their remaining armored forces managed to escape the final closure. However, the victory was definitive. The Battle of the Bulge officially concluded when the front lines were largely restored to their original positions by the end of January. The cost to the German army was absolute. They suffered over 100,000 casualties killed, wounded, or captured and, more critically, lost nearly 800 tanks and heavy assault guns, along with nearly all their remaining operational fuel and air reserves on the Western Front. This colossal loss guaranteed that the German army had spent its final offensive strength. The victory secured the Western Allied Front, leaving the path clear for the final, inexorable push across the Rhine and into the German heartland. The conclusion of the Battle of the Bulge in late January 1945, which saw the front lines restored largely to their original positions, marked the definitive and final end of the German army's ability to launch any massive, strategic-level offensive on the Western Front. This colossal, desperate gamble, Operation Watch on the Rhine, was not merely a tactical setback. It was a devastating expenditure of Germany's last operational reserves, a fatal military decision that irrevocably guaranteed the swift conclusion of the war in the West. The success of the Allied counteroffensive confirmed that the time of German breakthrough was utterly finished, and the period of total Allied dominance was now permanent. The most profound and immediate consequence of the failed offensive was the irreversible depletion of German resources. The battle cost the German army over 100,000 casualties killed, wounded, or captured and, more critically, destroyed nearly 800 tanks and heavy assault guns, along with countless transport vehicles and the vast majority of their remaining fuel reserves on the Western Front. These losses were catastrophic because the German industrial capacity, already crippled by relentless Allied strategic bombing, could not possibly replace them. The German High Command had thrown its final, best-trained armored divisions, the best remaining military capital, into a single, futile action, sacrificing them for a political fantasy rather than military necessity. The destruction of these final reserves guaranteed that, when the Allies launched their next, decisive offensive, there would be no mobile German force capable of defending the home country. Strategically, the battle provided immense, unexpected relief to the Soviet Union on the Eastern Front. The necessity of committing German reserves and armor to the desperate fighting in the Ardennes meant that these forces were unavailable to defend against the colossal Soviet winter offensive launched in January 1945. The German decision to prioritize the failing Western offensive over the rapidly collapsing Eastern Front contributed directly to the rapid, successful Soviet drive toward Berlin. The massive, strategic pressure exerted by the Soviet army on the Eastern Front, the ultimate reason the Ardennes Offensive had been conceived in the first place, was only intensified by Hitler's decision to squander his forces in the West. The German army was fatally caught in a two-front squeeze with no reserves left to reinforce either side. For the Western Allies, the high cost in casualties, over 80,000 American, British, and French soldiers, was paid for with immense, lasting strategic dividends. The hard-won victory proved the mettle and resilience of the American soldier, who had borne the brunt of the initial surprise attack, and forged the Allied forces into an even more cohesive, combat-hardened unit. The most critical advantage gained was geographical and strategic clearance. The elimination of the Bulge cleared the final obstacles in the Ardennes, secured the vital Meuse River line, and, most importantly, allowed the Allied armies to proceed directly to the final, massive objective, the Rhine River. The German army had been forced back to its own borders, leaving its defensive frontier virtually stripped of armor. The entire Western Front was now poised for the final, inexorable assault into the German heartland. The desperation of the German counterattack had failed spectacularly, and the path to final victory in Europe was now wide open. The clock had run out on the Third Reich,